A lot of people know Bonnie and Clyde through Hollywood's lens to daring lovers, stylish outlaws, and icons of rebellion. But once you look past the movie posters and the myths, their story becomes far more bleak and unsettling. The real Bonnie and Clyde lived a life shaped by desperation, constant fear, and escalating violence. Behind every glamorous photograph and every romanticized scene was a harsh truth about survival during the Great Depression, choices driven by trauma, and a crime spree that hurt ordinary people. Their legend is entertaining. Their reality is anything but. Number 1. The romantic outlaw lovers. Myth. Hollywood loves to frame Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow as two rebellious lovers, escaping a world that didn't understand them. But the real story doesn't resemble the dramatic, passionate fantasy often seen on screen. Their relationship grew out of the harsh conditions of the Great Depression, where money was scarce, families were unstable, and opportunities were almost non-existent for people in their social position. Clyde was already involved in theft and burglary before meeting Bonnie at age 19. By the time she joined him, he had a criminal record, a reputation with local law enforcement, and no realistic path to a legal life. They weren't two carefree lovers chasing adventure. They were two young people caught inside a cycle of fear, instability, and survival. Most films highlight the famous photographs of Bonnie posing with cigars and pistols, making her appear bold and fearless. In reality, those photos were staged as playful jokes among the gang, never meant to be read as symbols of rebellion. Newspapers of the 1930s sensationalized them, creating a glamorous image that didn't match the conditions they actually lived in. The real pair spent most of their time sleeping in stolen cars, washing with cold water from roadside ditches, and eating whatever cheap food they could grab while constantly watching for police. They moved quickly because they had no safe place to stay. Any attempt to slow down risked a violent confrontation. Another reality Hollywood rarely shows is Bonnie's severe health condition. After a car accident in 1933, she suffered third-degree burns on her leg, leaving her unable to walk without assistance. Clyde often had to physically carry her between hideouts, placing both of them in danger when trying to escape. The movies ignore this because it doesn't fit the idea of two glamorous criminals running effortlessly across America. The truth is far less dramatic and far more tragic. Bonnie lived with constant pain, and their lifestyle made proper medical treatment nearly impossible. Their emotional bond was real, but it wasn't a story of passion conquering the world. It was shaped by trauma, poverty, and desperation. They stayed together because they had nowhere else to go, not because they were chasing an exciting adventure. Their daily life was not about freedom or rebellion. It was about exhaustion, sleepless nights, and the fear of being killed by police during the next raid. Hollywood frames them as rebellious heroes, but the real Bonnie and Clyde spent most of their time tired, hungry, and terrified. Their story isn't a romantic legend. It's a reflection of what happens when two young people get trapped in circumstances they can't escape. Number 2. The Robin Hood criminals myth. Another popular myth suggests Bonnie and Clyde were modern-day Robin Hoods, stealing from the rich and helping the poor. This idea appears in films because it makes their story emotionally appealing, but there is no historical evidence to support it. They didn't distribute money to struggling families, nor did they target wealthy elites or powerful institutions for the sake of justice. Instead, they robbed what was easiest and closest small-town gas stations, roadside cafes, and small shops. These places were often owned by ordinary families who were barely surviving the Depression themselves. When Clyde stole from these businesses, it hurt locals who were already struggling to put food on the table. Hollywood prefers to highlight their occasional bank robberies because they look dramatic on screen. But in real life, banks were risky, heavily guarded, and often not profitable enough to justify the danger. Clyde robbed far fewer banks than movies claim. Most of his targets were everyday people who had nothing to do with wealth or corruption. Their crimes were driven solely by the need to stay ahead of law enforcement stealing gas, supplies, weapons, and any cash they could find quickly. Their motivation wasn't political, moral, or charitable. It was survival, plain and simple. Another overlooked detail is the emotional toll they left behind. While films glamorize the robberies as bold heists, the real events were chaotic and frightening. Victims were threatened at gunpoint, traumatized by the sudden violence, and sometimes injured. Families who owned the robbed shops often lost everything in a single night, especially when the stolen money was their only way to keep their business open. Clyde didn't view these families as enemies. They were simply easy targets. But the damage was real, and it contradicts the Hollywood image of two noble criminals taking from the powerful. This myth survived because people wanted heroes during a time when banks and government institutions felt distant and untrustworthy. The public, tired of economic hardship, was drawn to the idea of rebels fighting the system. Newspapers used sensational headlines to sell stories, and the legend grew quickly. But legends and facts are different things. Bonnie and Clyde were not champions of the common man. They were fugitives who used whatever resources they could take from the same communities struggling around them. Their legacy is often romanticized because the darker truth is uncomfortable. They didn't fight for anyone but themselves. Number 3. The victims of a cruel system. Myth. Hollywood sometimes suggests that Bonnie and Clyde were innocent young people pushed into crime by an unfair justice system. This myth usually focuses on Clyde's time on the Texas prison farms, where he experienced harsh conditions and abuse. It's true that these institutions were notorious for brutal treatment, overcrowding, and poor oversight. Clyde did suffer greatly there, and the experience shaped his deep hatred of the prison system for the rest of his life. But the idea that he became a criminal only because the system mistreated him is misleading. Clyde was committing burglaries and car theft long before he ever entered prison. His criminal behavior wasn't the result of a corrupt system targeting him. It was a pattern he chose early and continued to escalate after release. When Clyde left prison, instead of attempting to rebuild his life, he quickly returned to theft and formed the early versions of what became the Barrow gang. Their actions were not minor crimes committed out of desperation. The gang engaged in multiple kidnappings, shootouts, and armed robberies. Several law enforcement officers lost their lives during their confrontations with the gang. Hollywood often softens these facts to maintain the image of a tragic outlaw couple. But avoiding the violence changes the nature of the story. Police weren't hunting harmless dreamers. They were pursuing heavily armed fugitives who repeatedly used violence to escape capture. Clyde's determination to avoid returning to prison influenced almost every decision he made. This meant that any interaction with law enforcement could turn deadly because he refused to surrender. Bonnie, despite not killing anyone personally, stayed with the gang and participated in the lifestyle, fully aware of the risks and the consequences. Their choices weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate acts that put others' lives in danger. The justice system of the 1930s certainly had flaws, and prison farms were known for severe abuses. But Bonnie and Clyde were not passive victims of these failures. Their crimes continued even when they had the opportunity to step away. They never attempted a legal life together, never looked for work, and never sought a different path. Instead, they escalated their actions, attracted national attention, and became symbols of lawlessness during one of America's most unstable eras. The myth that the system forced them into crime ignores the core truth. The Barrow gang chose a violent path long before the country chose to mythologize them. Number 4. The harmless outlaws who only shot when threatened. Myth. Hollywood often tries to soften the violence surrounding Bonnie and Clyde by suggesting they only fired their weapons when danger cornered them, almost as if they were gentle rebels pushed into moments of desperation. But the documented record shows something much more serious. Clyde Barrow constantly traveled armed with weapons far beyond what ordinary criminals carried. His preferred firearm was the Browning automatic rifle, an extremely powerful military-grade weapon stolen from National Guard armories. The bar fired 30-6 rounds capable of piercing car doors, and Clyde valued it specifically because it gave him a way to break through police roadblocks or escape an ambush before officers could react. Carrying that level of firepower shows clear intent. He was prepared to shoot long before anyone threatened him. Several lawmen lost their lives in confrontations involving the Barrow gang, and many others suffered injuries during chaotic escapes. These weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were the direct result of Clyde's commitment to resist arrest at all costs. Bonnie's portrayal has also been heavily distorted over the decades. Films often reduce her to a reluctant bystander dragged along by Clyde's choices, or they frame her involvement as minimal and harmless. But the available evidence doesn't support that image. While historians still debate whether she personally fired at officers, there is no question about her active participation in the gang's lifestyle. Eyewitness accounts, police reports, and statements from captured gang members all describe Bonnie helping during escapes, acting as a lookout during robberies, and staying fully aware of the plans and risks involved. Officers who survived encounters said she played a direct role in the gang's ability to evade capture. Even if she didn't pull a trigger, her presence was far from passive support. She was part of the operations, part of the planning, and part of the flight. The idea that the pair only fought back when cornered ignores how often their actions escalated confrontations. The gang was known for opening fire to break through police traps, and officers in rural areas were warned repeatedly that stopping the Barrow car could turn deadly. The gang's escape strategy relied on overwhelming force-fast, aggressive, and unpredictable. Law enforcement in the early 1930s faced limited communication systems, outdated equipment, and long distances between towns, which made fugitives like Bonnie and Clyde especially dangerous. Officers were often outgunned, and the gang's willingness to fire first created situations that spiraled into violence within seconds. Hollywood softens all of this because acknowledging the real level of harm challenges the romantic narrative audiences enjoy. Films rarely show how many communities were left shaken after shootouts, or how many families endured lifelong grief because of those violent encounters. Movies prefer to show Bonnie and Clyde exchanging fire with faceless police forces, as if the officers were obstacles rather than real people doing their jobs. But the actual historical record shows terrified deputies, inexperienced small-town officers, and highway patrolmen who walked into situations far more lethal than they imagined. Some officers who died were ambushed simply for approaching a parked car. Others were shot while trying to perform routine stops, never expecting the level of resistance they met. The myth of harmless outlaws is appealing because it preserves the idea of Bonnie and Clyde as tragic heroes. But the reality is that every bullet fired came from a decision they made long before the moment of confrontation. They armed themselves heavily. They rehearsed how to respond to roadblocks, and they accepted that killing officers might be part of their escape strategy. The communities left behind weren't dealing with a glamorous legend. They were dealing with the very real consequences of two fugitives who refused to face arrest and treated every attempt to stop them as a battle for survival. Understanding this reality strips away the romantic glaze and shows just how much damage Hollywood tends to hide in its storytelling. Number 5. The glamorous outlaw ending. Myth. Few moments in crime history have been mythologized as intensely as the deaths of Bonnie and Clyde. Films often portray their final stand as a dramatic, almost cinematic farewell. Two devoted lovers facing fate together, defiant until the last breath. Slow-motion shots, soft lighting, and poetic music transform their deaths into a Hollywood spectacle. But the real ending was not symbolic or beautiful. It was sudden, violent, and without any hint of romance. After months of gathering evidence and tracking the couple across multiple states, former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer was tasked with stopping the pair. Hamer studied their patterns, speaking with local sheriffs, former gang members, and anyone who had crossed paths with them. His goal wasn't to create a showdown, it was to prevent more deaths. The Barrow gang had already killed law enforcement officers who attempted arrests, and authorities across the region believed the pair would never surrender peacefully. Clyde himself had repeatedly stated that he would die before returning to prison. This wasn't bravado. It was a consistent pattern of behavior, demonstrated during previous shootouts. When Hamer and his posse discovered the couple's likely travel route in rural Louisiana, they prepared an ambush. There was no negotiation or plan for a warning shot. Officers knew the danger of hesitation, and they understood that giving Bonnie and Clyde even a few seconds could mean another deadly escape. That morning in May 1934, as the couple approached in their Ford V8, the posse opened fire immediately. Over 100 rounds were discharged in a matter of seconds. Clyde died nearly instantly. Bonnie screamed in terror as the gunfire continued. There was no dramatic final glance, no tender last words, and no iconic last gesture. Their deaths were abrupt, painful, and entirely devoid of Hollywood glamour. The aftermath was equally far from the romantic image that movies often promote. Photos taken at the scene showed the car riddled with bullets, shattered glass everywhere, and bodies slumped in unnatural positions. The damage made it impossible to imagine any version of the story that resembled beauty or heroism. Yet newspapers printed sensational headlines and dramatic imagery, fueling the myth even further. The public gathered in massive crowds, some attempting to grab pieces of clothing, hair, or glass from the scene as souvenirs. This unsettling behavior revealed how far the fascination with Bonnie and Clyde had drifted from the harsh reality of their actions. The myth of the glamorous ending persists because people prefer stories that fit a narrative. A tragic finale gives emotional closure, while the real ending forces viewers to confront the uncomfortable truth. Bonnie and Clyde weren't defiant rebels dying for a cause. They were fugitives whose violent path ended the same way it had unfolded, chaotically and without control. No one won in that moment. The officers carried the burden of taking lives. The families of victims never received closure, and the communities left behind had to reconcile the myth with the reality. Understanding what truly happened dismantles the belief that Bonnie and Clyde lived or died as legends. Their final moments weren't a testament to love or rebellion. They were the inevitable result of years spent running, resisting, and escalating every encounter. The Hollywood version may offer spectacle, but the historical truth exposes the darker, less glamorous weight behind those final seconds on that Louisiana road.